afternoon, and welcome to all of you here with us today, as well as those of you who are able to join us online. My name is Carlos Ulises de Sena. I am Director of the Office of Undergraduate Intellectual Life and incoming Acting Director of the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice in New Brunswick. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to Viral Conditions, a World AIDS celebration in times of COVID. This is a celebration to mark World AIDS Day, which is today, December 1st, but also to signal in a very specific way a framework for a year-long set of programmatic initiatives at ISERJ New Brunswick, and also to call our broad Rutgers community throughout our system, New Brunswick, Camden, Newark, and Robert Wood Johnson, to think of and accompany us in this process through engagements involving programmatic work, events such as this one, to get us all to think together about the implications of a moment like today, where we get to celebrate World AIDS Day, but we need to do it while being cognizant that our present condition is changed in important ways, in seismic ways, if you will, by the COVID pandemic in which we're still ensnared. I thought it was important to mark World AIDS Day, as this is one of those days that is very near and dear to me as someone who's a child of the AIDS epidemic. I always think of myself as a 1.5 generation gay man coming of age at a time of AIDS when the trauma of the death of a generation of gay men was very latent in my experience of coming into being as a gay man, as an immigrant in this country. And finding in the last 5 to 7 years that World AIDS Day events, though many of us made the effort to make sure they kept appearing on a regular basis throughout Rutgers and other places, were less and less attended, given the shifts in the epidemic, but also a relative invisibilization of the populations that are still battling against it, including Black and Brown communities throughout this country and in other parts of the world. I think it's an important moment to also consider the very stark difference in the response to COVID and the recent outbreak of monkeypox, which in my sort of with the historical memory that I have, it was very hard not to see what was going on, the kind of hush-hush way in which the media treated monkeypox as sort of a reflection of lessons that were fundamentally not learned from the AIDS epidemic, in contrast with the very all-hands-on-deck approach to COVID. And so one of the fundamental questions that I want to pose to the panel, and that I hope our panelists will be able to engage in different ways, and that we will all continue to simmer in as we go through this event and the coming year of activities, is what is it that we are learning or not learning systemically in responding to a world that is increasingly shaped by epidemic outbreaks, where the viral is part of life. The viral and the vital are entwined in a way that perhaps we're facing for the first time with a kind of intensity and the element of connection with an increased precarity of our own species in a planet that is beleaguered by all kinds of changes. So what this panel is going to do is featuring students, folks who have been studying, thinking, and engaging, activists raising hell in these crises, to consider the long historical dimensions and the practicality of living the moment that we're in. I want to take a moment before I introduce the speakers to thank the various parties who have made this event possible. As you know, to make something as complex as this happen in the format in which we are making it happen through a hybrid format takes a lot of hands, a lot of goodwill, and a lot of vision. First of all, I want to thank our speakers for agreeing to grace us with their wisdom and their presence today in all of their various formats. I want to thank my colleagues at the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice, Michelle Stevens as the Executive Director of the Institute, and Erica Armstrong Dunbar in particular for supporting me in the process of taking up the framing of this year of work in New Brunswick. I also want to thank Tanny Bentley, who's our communications director and the director of the show, if you will, that you're having, that you are about to engage now. Tanya McDonald for all of the administrative wherewithal and resourcefulness that she's brought to this work. The Rutgers Libraries, who have been willing and resourceful partners, very generous in this undertaking, and others. We look forward to many more collaborations, and the ITV crew that is helping us with the technicalities of making sure that this event is not only broadcast adequately, but also recorded in a way that allows us to preserve it as an important document. I'm going to introduce the speakers briefly, and the format is going to be as follows. Each speaker will speak for about 20 minutes. We have been advised in advance by one of our speakers that he's going to take a little longer, but he's promised that this is going to be entertaining, so we'll hold him to that. And then we will have opportunity for a Q&A. Those of you watching elsewhere will have opportunities to send in your questions. Those questions will be brought forward for the latter part of the discussion, and we look forward to the conversation. We'll start with Dr. Edgar Rivera Colon, who's a medical anthropologist and teaches courses on health justice and the history of racism in medicine at the University of Southern California's Keck School of Medicine's Narrative Medicine program. Dr. Rivera Colon, I have to say, and note, not only a dear friend and colleague, but is also a Rutgers PhD. I think it's an important point of pride for our university. He was a faculty member at Columbia University's Narrative Medicine program, where he trained students in qualitative research methods. With his Columbia colleagues, he co-authored the award-winning textbook, The Principles and Practice of Narrative Medicine. And recently, he and Patrick Hebert, who is with us today as well, published the essay titled Slow Burn, Humid Pitch, Cultivating Care While Living La Comida Loca in the NACLA report on the Americas. His forthcoming book project is titled Love Comes in Knots, Meditations in the American Labyrinth. And he hosts a podcast about politics and spirituality called Karl Marx ate my field notes. It's definitely worth a listen. Our second speaker is Mindy Fulilove. Dr. Fulilove is a social psychiatrist and professor of urban policy and health at the New School. She completed her undergraduate work at Bryn Mawr College, went to medical school at the Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons, and completed psychiatric residency at New York Hospital, Westchester Division, and Montefiore Hospital. Since '86, she has conducted research on AIDS and other epidemics of poor communities, with a special interest in the relationship between the collapse of communities and the decline in health. She has published over 100 scientific papers and 8 books, and among her books are the highly regarded Urban Restoration Trilogy, Root Shock, How Tearing Up City Neighborhoods Hurts America and What We Can Do About It, Urban Alchemy, Restoring Joy in America's Sorted Out Cities, and Main Street, How a City's Heart Connects Us All. She has received many awards for her work, including 2 honorary doctorates, and she's a Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association and an honorary member of the American Institute of Architects. Last but not least is someone who is not only a very dear friend of many years, but someone with whom I have very explicitly been scheming this series of programs. Pato Hebert, who is an artist, teacher, and organizer. He has worked in HIV prevention initiatives with queer communities of color since 1994. He continues these grassroots efforts at local and transnational levels, working with social movements and community organizations to develop innovative approaches to HIV mobilization, programs, advocacy, and justice. He curated exhibitions and led creative initiatives at the International AIDS Conference in conferences in Vienna in 2010, Melbourne in 2014, Durban in 2016, Amsterdam in 2018. He's a COVID-19 long hauler, living with the impacts of the coronavirus and publicly addressing the pandemic since March of 2020. His lingering solo exhibition is about long hauling debuted at Pitzer College in 2022, and he currently serves as chair and an associate professor of art in the Department of Art and Public Policy at the Tisch School of the Arts at NYU. We will start with Edgar. Very much great gratitude to the speakers for accompanying us today, and I look forward to learn from what they will share and the opportunity that we will have to engage in conversation. Edgar?
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity to share thoughts with you on this World AIDS Day. I was just reminding myself that this is also the day that Miss Rosa Parks did not go to the back of the bus. And I know my colleagues in Orange, New Jersey are going to be celebrating Mrs. Parks' memory and her work and the Montgomery bus boycott. So I think there's a momentous quality to the day on many levels. First of all, I would just like to thank Carlos, Dr. DeSena, the comrades at the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice at Rutgers, my alma mater. Obviously, I'm wearing red today because it is World AIDS Day, but it's also, one of the colors of Rutgers. That is, I have good memories of Rutgers as a PhD student there. I also want to send, my greetings, my comradely greetings to Pato and to Mindy. Mindy and I have been involved in the People's CDC, amongst other projects of late. Some projects, you choose, and some projects history hoist upon you. And in my case, the AIDS crisis was how I became a medical anthropologist. I didn't study medical anthropology. I just started doing research with folks who were dealing with the HIV/AIDS pandemic, Black Latinx communities, LGBTQ folk in New York City. And that's really how I became a medical anthropologist. And I have the privilege of teaching future physicians now here in LA. So I'm coming to you from East Los Angeles. From my window, I can see the San Gabriel Mountains. And I want to begin today with a sort of a reflection on what I would call lo concreto, the concrete. And I'm going to privilege Spanish in my discussion as a way of thinking about our work. So many languages are privileged, like French or German in our work, but Spanish is not. So let's try to recenter that Spanish language a little bit. First and foremost, if we look at the United Nations AIDS website, in the year 2021, 1.5 million people were newly infected. There are 38.4 million people who are living with AIDS at the moment, historically speaking. And in 2021, 650,000 people died worldwide. Right? So these are the concrete numbers, and all those numbers are lives, their stories, their communities, their kinship systems, their friendship networks, their professional networks. In terms of COVID, total cases at this point, according to the Johns Hopkins dashboard, is 643 million folks all over the world. 6.6 million people have died of COVID, including obviously my own mom passed away, as did our matriarch, my aunt in Jersey City, and the elder man of our, I guess, the patriarch of our family in Puerto Rico as well. So this has been very direct for me in terms of my own kinship system. And I'm sure there are many people who are on this webinar in Alexander Library who have lost loved ones and friends as a result of COVID and of AIDS. Right now, we have total cases of 98 million people who have COVID. And the US deaths here are over 1 million at this point, over 1 million. So that's the concrete, the concreto, right? And we begin our analysis with the concrete. And I'm going to begin with a vignette. This is the perverse disciplinary likes of anthropologists who like to tell stories. So I'm going to tell a story. And the story is a very basic one. Today, I was walking the family dog. I live here with my sister, her wife, and my 2 nieces. And there had been a houseless person who's been living in their van, a young woman and a young man, who I think are Latinx. And the police were there. And they were charging their car, right? One policeman was Asian, another was Latinx, right? And I watched the procedures. They were relatively friendly, but I thought to myself, isn't this interesting, right? That one of the things that we should think about and we should, consider is how these moments, if you will, these vignettes, these scenes are instructive about how our society has changed in order to maintain power for a few. It wasn't a white police officer. It was officers of color. I just interacted with the woman by smiling and directing my attention to her, and she smiled back and talked to me about the dog. And this is just a moment, right? But clearly, the role of the police was to clear her out of our neighborhood. And probably the homeowners, I'm not a homeowner, called the police and they interacted with her. It looked like a gentle way. I watched as long as I could. And I think the supposition was, well, now that your car's fixed, get the hell out of here, right? And I think that this reminds me of that quote from actually Mindy's book, like, yes, we know we will always have the poor with us, but do we have to see them? Do we have to see them all the time? And I think one of the things that I would want folks to keep on thinking about today is that what we're experiencing today in terms of COVID, in terms of HIV/AIDS, is part of a collapse of basic public health infrastructure through financialization. The health system that we have in the US is based upon what we could easily call just-in-time production, which means you just have enough staff, enough resources. And what the pandemic taught us was that at any time a pandemic breaks out, that system goes into complete crisis. And we saw that in Queens, in New York City. We saw it here in LA, where the majority of people who died were Latinx working class people, many of them agricultural workers. And so when we go to the concrete, lo concreto, as we look at these as instantiations or ultimate instances of these other mediating forces and factors, right? Why do we have a pandemic? It's very simple. Agro-industrial business farming. That's why we have it. It has invaded spaces that were habitats for wild animals. In one case, bats, you can argue. Those get transferred into human populations because of the stresses on those environments. And that business model is financed, right, and taken care of in the centers of London and Paris and New York and LA and Shanghai and South Africa. You can think about all the financial centers of the world, right? And that is really the beginning of this pandemic, that zoonosis, that transfer from human populations of a novel virus from wild animals, basically, in this case, we think bats, right? That is a result of the kind of capitalism we have. That is not an accident. It's not something that people were, well, most people were surprised, but people who studied this, like our colleague, Dr. Rob Wallace, had called this a number of years before it happened, right? So with the AIDS pandemic, what we see, and this is the work of people like Roderick Wallace, Deborah Wallace, Mindy's work, all those things were facilitated in terms of HIV/AIDS by the collapse in investment in cities, in basic infrastructure, in education, in healthcare, in policing, in fire services. Not that I'm arguing for more policing, believe me, I'm not. But what I'm saying is that all that is a conjuncture, right? And what we're seeing today, and I think Carlos was right, we're going to see continual pandemics, continual collapse. And what will be our response, right? So we look at lo concreto, the concrete, and then we have to ask ourselves, what is lo actual? What is the actual, right? And by actual, I mean all the possibilities that can be incarnated, that can actually occur if we push one way or push another way. So this is where we begin to ask ourselves, how do we do basic social analysis in the country we're living in? What are the actualities and potentialities? And, you know, I've been part of the People's CDC since the beginning, when Mindy insisted upon recruiting me to be a facilitator. And I said, yes, you know, that's the only way you grow in this life, is by just saying yes to things you weren't expecting. And one of the things that's clear to me is that we made a choice. We were going to create a space where people who were worried about COVID, affected by COVID, were professionals who were dealing in public health, were physicians, were community people, community organizers and activists, educators, should come together and find out what's the most reliable information that we can bring together as many of us non-experts. And as Mindy will talk to you about, a lot of our model was ACTA in many ways, right? Although we're a little different, right? And so when we think about lo actual, we're just not thinking about, well, here's the reality, nothing else can happen, because you have to engage in a type of political imagination in order to change things. And this is why the example of Miss Parks is so profound. She imagined, because she was an activist, because she was the chair of the local chapter of the NAACP, and you can read that book by Theo Harris, The Radical Life of Miss Rosa Parks, and you'll see that she was a militant and a thinker and someone who was in many ways very humble, but understood the moment she was living, right? And said, no, I'm not going to do this. And there have been other activists who had done it before, but it was the crystallization of that movement and then the Montgomery boycott and that mass refusal. And also not only refusal, but creating networks of mutual aid. And I think a lot of the work we do at the People's CDC is a form of mutual aid. And all of us have learned a lot about mutual aid. And when we think about the HIV/AIDS crisis, the care that needed to occur with the buddy system that people had, family members who took care of people, friendship networks that took care of people, that's mutual aid. And we know, certainly I know from my experience in Latinx and Black communities, LGBTQ communities, but in general, is that mutual aid is not new to us, right? It's not new. It's not something that we discovered during any crisis. We've been doing that as a matter of course. So, lo concreto, lo actual, la coyuntura, the conjuncture of political forces, and also, oddly enough, of spiritual forces, because a lot of our work has to be based on some sense of soul, some sense of spirit. And here, I'm not arguing that you should be a theist. I happen to be one, and a Marxist at the same time, but I'm arguing that there is something bigger that needs to sustain us in our work. And Carlos and I have had these sort of conversations. Carlos sort of coined the phrase la obra as opposed to trabajo, right? French has the same distinction between sort of work and this other piece, the collection of work. And what Carlos meant by that was you have your work that you do because you got to pay the rent and take care of your nieces or take care of your kids or what have you, or be a good grandma, grandpa, whatever it is that you need to do, right? But you also have la obra, which is the work that sustains life, the work that you pass on to the generations that are coming. And I'm only here because people in the communities that fought HIV/AIDS, that continue to fight, de la obra. They did the trabajo too because they had to put food on the table, but they did la obra. They did that other work, what I call soul work, right? That comes out of soul power. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And I just want to be clear on time. I don't want to go over my time limit. So along with la coyuntura, this sort of like conjuncture of forces that we have to keep on analyzing, part of that is beginning to think of yourself as beyond an individual, as something beyond the individual themselves. And one of the I think, ideological terrors of the society is to convince people they're only individuals, right? And I think that our traditions, and their various forms, right? They could be the Yoruba-based traditions. It could be traditions that come out of faith communities. It could be traditions that come out of activism and political radicalism. It could be the kind of stuff we're seeing with queer and trans folks today in terms of developing communities, mutual aid, whatever your tradition, right? Some part of it has to be this conjunctural analysis. What are the actual forces against us? Who are they? What actual, sort of strengths do we have? What strengths do we have to develop? And where are our places of retreat? And I remember having a conversation with Pato about this in this conversation that was printed out by NACLA. And part of this idea is, el replegue, the tactical retreat, right? That there are times when you need to retreat, gather your forces together, see what's what, and then move forward, right? And in a society that's in a collapse, and it's collapsing because of the climate change crisis, it's collapsing because there's no political legitimacy in many ways to the elites, the political and economic elites that run the show. We know they're cynical. The Biden administration is cynical in one way. Trump was cynical in another way, right? But, on one level, you want to deal with Democrat cynics, right, instead of fascist cynics any day of the week. But we are clear that in the end, they will run this world and this country off the cliff because of profit, right? We're clear on that. Like, we're not naive about that. And we know those contradictions and how to create space in them. So that also means that we have to engage in revolutionary discernment. That means collectively, us coming together and really discerning, what are our desires? What are the things we're for? What are the things we want to build? What are the kind of friendships and kinship networks we want to invest in? I don't like to use invest, but to build, to create, to sustain. Who are the elders we love? Who are the young people who are at the front? What wisdom can we get from those elders? What will they give us? What will we give them, right? All these questions are part of revolutionary discernment, right? And this is going to sound weird coming from an anthropologist, a social scientist, but I actually think we got to get into this collective passions of the soul, right? That the passions that we're talking about, on some level, passions, you suffer them, right? Literally in the Latin, it's pateo, right? And it's interesting, pateo, pato, it's interesting. It's sort of, wordplay there. You could think about pato, is you suffer them, right? You become their bottom, right? And you live them, right? And they capture you. But we have to do that collectively. What are the passions that are moving us towards greater freedom? What are the passions that are moving us to unfreedom, to that other project, right? And this society is really built on many things. One is surveillance capitalism, digital surveillance, entertainment, spectacle. So we need to capture those collective moments of silence, of retreat, of discernment, and oddly enough, slow down. We have to slow down. The crisis wants us to speed up. I understand urgency, but we cannot give in to the temporal logic of the crisis. It will undo us. And we've seen the results of the kind of mental health challenges that people have had to deal with in this crisis and the ongoing crisis. So I guess what I want you to share with you today is what I've learned living through two major pandemics and epidemics that aren't done. They're not done. And anticipating more to come. One thing I've really learned is don't respond to the moment unless you can name it, right? Respond to the crisis in the kind of tools that will allow you to do casualty reduction, right? A lot of our work is casualty reduction, making sure that people survive for the next struggle. And of course, all of us have been informed by harm reduction and learning about that. But I think part of it is also understanding this tactical thing, that there are many ways of confronting the forces of unfreedom. There are people in this space, in your lives, I'm speaking especially to the graduate students and students, who have learned to work within these institutions and to create spaces and look at the contradictions of the institutions to push them. Now, I'm a bit of an anarchist. I prefer to build independent institutions, but we have to have the dialectic of both. We have to have the dialectic of both. We have to have folks who know how to do that internal jiu-jitsu. We need the folks who are going to run institutes, going to create spaces for folks. So we have that dialectic between the inside and the outside, right? Always moving forward. That's what social movement is. The reason institutions change is because social movements come to their door and say, y'all better change, right? And that's when the changes occur. They're not the changes we want, but they create enough space to push for other changes. So we have to be dialectical that way. We have to maintain our safe and sacred spaces, right? Maintain those spaces. And it could be it could be your kinship network. In my dissertation work was on the house ballroom community. That's another way of creating those safe and sacred spaces, right? It could be an ile, a family in the Yoruba tradition, in Santeria. It can be all kinds, it takes all kinds of forms, right? And I think that what the test of these kind of times, right? AIDS, the pandemic, the ecological crisis, the climate catastrophes that are occurring, the emerging civil war that's occurring in this country, undeclared, but very loudly there, right? All of that are times when we have to hone our skills of analysis, hone our skills of study together, hone our skills of creating a type of leadership, but also a type of sort of, if you will, servanthood, servicehood, where you begin to think about that broader picture. And we have to defend those safe and sacred spaces. I've been saying this to a lot of community groups, and this is very important, especially for academics to think about. Academics are the easiest people to attack if they're not connected to a local base, right? And when the communist scare, the McCarthy period occurred, some of the first people who were attacked were Hollywood people, precisely because they weren't grounded in the unions, right? They didn't have a base. And then from there, they went to the base, the union movement, right? And we're going to see more and more repression as we go on in this society, and the use of political violence by the right, right? The right is doing what it's not always done, but in this moment in the US, there's two phenomena going on. One is the restriction of voting rights, and which this is at state level legislators, right, to restrict access to the vote. And the other is the creation of paramilitaries, right, that already existed, and the Republican Party being the conduit of that. So we have to be very clear, this is where these forces are at. And it's taken 40 to 50 years for these people to get here, right, to control the Supreme Court and so on. So I think that as we, I just want to see this message. I don't want to be over time. I think Carlos is like saying, you're over time, comrade. Let's see. Wrap up soon. Okay, so what I want to say simply is this. These are times to think about the broader picture and to also pull on our soul power. And that soul power is a collective power that we get in the movements that we're part of, and they can be a resource for the future. And I'm going to end right there. And thank you for the notice, Carlos. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It was very funny. Without further ado, let's transition and welcome Dr. Fullilove. And in the interest of time, I'll probably signal. I'll figure out a way to signal to Dr. Fullilove just so that we can leave enough time for a Q&A. But thank you again and welcome.
Unmute. I'm unmuted. Can you hear me? Oh, good, good, good. I'm going to share my screen. I think I'm going to share my screen. Yep. Thank you so much, Edgar. That was just really, truly inspiring. And I especially like kind of the note that you ended on, that we have to see the broader picture and we have to draw on soul power. And be rooted in communities. It's also important. And you mentioned that today is December 1st, which is the, as you know, the day that Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus. And December 5th, which is Monday, is when she, they called the Montgomery bus boycott and none of the Black people rode the bus. What's important is that she actually did this on a Thursday. And the Montgomery bus boycott started on Monday, and there were 50,000 Black people in Montgomery, and they didn't ride the bus on Monday. So that tells you something about the strength and the organization of that community, that they could call a boycott on Thursday, and it would be successful on Monday. And it also tells you something about the collapse of society, because I don't think there are any communities in the United States where we could pull that off today. I want to talk a little bit about AIDS. I got involved in AIDS as a researcher in 1986. From the CDC museum, they said, pointed out to us that, there was this new thing coming along. And in 1981, I was in my last year of psychiatric residency. It was sort of a few cases. They weren't really near me. It took a few years before it really became part of my world. But the key thing about it was, which was so shocking to me, but from the beginning, was that it was really like there was like a blackout about how important this was. Now think about it. Here's a new disease which attacks the immune system. A sensible society says, well, we need our immune system to stay alive. Let's find out what this is about. But we didn't do that. And so that's a real marker of the madness of America. And some work I did with Roderick Wallace, a book called Collective Consciousness and Its Discontents, talk about a model of epidemic response that my group helped develop. And we talked about 3 phases. The first being recognition, that in an epidemic you have to say, oh, there is. And the second phase, you have to commit resources. And in the third phase, there's an actual realignment that societies agree to work together differently. This is a study we did in Alameda County, right across the bay from San Francisco. Huge AIDS epidemic in San Francisco. We asked the question, is Alameda doing what they should be doing? So what you should be doing in a pandemic is acknowledging it right away and then implementing all the things you need to do to limit cases. What happened in Alameda was not that. And so the epidemic just went on and on and on and on, which is what happens if you don't have an immediate response and if you don't do what you're supposed to do to limit cases, or according to whatever it is you know at the moment. And so it was really communities organizing. It took a while for things to get organized. It took a while to get to the point of displaying the AIDS quilt on the mall in Washington, D.C. Sort of having to come from scratch and build all that capacity to be able to make that statement in the face of the stigma and to get the nation to respond. So they began to talk about this AIDS care continuum. And they talk about being infected and diagnosed, linked to care, retained in care, on antiretroviral therapy, and with suppressed viral load. And this is from 2011, but it's still the same, that we don't know, we don't do what we're supposed to do. And this is structural. It's what Edgar's talking about. And the true measure of how much we're trapped by our structure is the difference between how many people are HIV infected and how many people have this suppressed viral load, which is what they say is really what we should be doing. So it's sort of really important to be able to say, how far off are we in how we're managing a pandemic? And as Carlos pointed out, we're going to be managing more and more of these. So what is it we're supposed to have learned? One of the things we're supposed to have learned is that we're trapped by structure. Structure drives response to epidemics, not sanity. So in the CDC Museum, they said that AIDS has become one of our greatest public health challenges, and it remains. So prevention is still the best strategy, and we have inadequate prevention. They don't say that. So this is kind of the thing that really still remains a problem, which is that the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, fabulous center of knowledge, really a lot of very, very smart people who know what they're doing, but a lot of political barriers between what they know and what they can actually do. So COVID comes along, and when we start to compare the pandemics, as Edgar did, sort of AIDS deaths are at this point many, many, many more. But actually, COVID deaths in the U.S. are a much greater percentage, right? 1/6 of all COVID deaths are in the U.S., whereas it's a much smaller fraction of AIDS deaths worldwide. And that tells us something very fundamental about the difference of the disease. And how well are we managing? And we're not managing very well at all. So the other thing that is really important is that we're not going into this COVID pandemic, again, as Edgar said, just like it's just the COVID pandemic, but it's all these pandemics. I love this cover of The Nation that had this horrible tick apocalypse, how humans disrupted the environment and fueled a new era of tick-borne disease. Like ticks, insects kind of scare me, but so making it so big, it's like, whoa. Anyway, there's all these tick-borne diseases that are emerging from ecosystems that have been fractured. So we're in a messy situation. So imagine being in a messy situation with a dysfunctional health system. That's really what's going on here. That's scary. Reverend Liz Theoharis, who's co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, said, "We are organizing amidst some of the harshest political, economic, cultural, and climate conditions in this country's history. Between the flash flooding in Kentucky, the deaths at the border, sweepings of encampments of the most vulnerable, the threat of nuclear annihilation, and other threats to our lives and livelihoods, the isolation can make us feel like change is impossible." That is really important. And Edgar kept emphasizing we have to do conjunctural analysis. What is the moment that we're in? This is an exceptionally difficult moment that we are in. So when you're in a difficult moment, it's always good to look back, as December 1st at the University of Orange, where I'm very active, we look back at Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. But here I want to talk about the coalition that ended slavery. So this is a statue to William Lloyd Garrison. So part of the coalition was the sort of came from the New England middle class, educated people who understood the horrors of slavery. And so the huge anti-slavery movement that was made up of men and women. Women played a very important role in the anti-slavery movement. And one of the examples of this is this monument in Syracuse, New York, to the Jerry Rescue. Jerry was a free black man who lived in Syracuse, was captured under the fugitive slave law, and the citizens of Syracuse and other people were gathered at an anti-slavery convention right at that time. They basically went to the jail, took him out, took him to Canada. So just rescued him and took him out of the country so he wouldn't be sent into slavery. So this work was extremely difficult. And there's a story that Sojourner Truth, who was a very important African-American leader of this, was talking to Frederick Douglass, who was very discouraged. And he suggested that God had abandoned African Americans. And she said, Frederick, is God dead? And it is important when you think about how long the struggle was. So she said this in 1847. The Civil War doesn't end until 1865. So they're a long way from, the sort of actual real triumph of their movement. And the issue that she's addressing is, how do you hold on? This kind of her form of the spiritual power that keeps people going through very dark days. So this coalition of educated and working class white men, of women, of African Americans, of freed slaves, was able to succeed in abolishing slavery, but it collapsed. This is a beautiful statue which is in Rochester, and shows Susan B. Anthony talking to Frederick Douglass, having tea together. Now, there came a big crisis. So the 15th Amendment said the right of citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But women of all races were still denied the right to vote. And to her, this was unacceptable. And so the coalition that had succeeded in abolishing slavery, that coalition fell apart. The white women said, no, we won't help you if we're not also going to get the vote. To which Frederick Douglass said, I do not see how anyone can pretend that there's the same urgency in giving the ballot to women as to the Negro. With us, the question is a matter of life and death, at least in 15 states of the Union. When women, because they are women, are hunted down through the cities of New York and New Orleans, when they are in danger of having their homes burnt down over their heads, when their children are not allowed to enter schools, then they will have an urgency to obtain the ballot equal to our own. And of course, with the end of the Civil War and the beginning of Reconstruction, especially in the first couple of years of Reconstruction, the Ku Klux Klan came sweeping across basically the landscape and murdering people. So September 1868, this terrible, deadliest massacre in Reconstruction era in Louisiana. 200 African Americans were killed, hunted down and killed. This went on all over the South, not always in those numbers, but all over the South. The Klan was suppressed at that time, and progressive Republicans supported Reconstruction for a while. But the power of the coalition did not go into this new era. The power of the coalition was falling apart. And this becomes an incredible turning point in the history of the United States. If the coalition that had destroyed slavery had understood how important Reconstruction was and had held firm, we would be in a different situation right now. So on the one hand, coalitions are the greatest possibility for progress in our society. They are created around common interests shared by diverse groups. They are very fragile. These are three important things to understand about coalitions. So as Edgar mentioned, we formed a coalition called the People's CDC. And as one of the people who started it, it basically, I said to my friends, I don't know what to think. I read this data, I see what the CDC is coming out with, but what's really going on? And so we asked people to, would you please come with us? Let's read the literature and let people know what's going on. TAG, the Treatment Action Group that came out of ACT UP, was very much our model of people who just decided, okay, we're going to read the scientific literature, and we're going to push NIH to do the right thing. And so we started this People's CDC. You can find us on the web at peoplescdc.org. And so basically we have this loose set of teams. We made this slide was made at one point. The teams come and go. We don't always have the same teams. People get interested in new ideas, so new teams arise, old teams finish their work. The idea is that the teams, so it's a group of volunteers, get together and say, we want to do something. For example, one of our teams is called Weather Report. And so they produce a weekly report on the state of COVID. And you can sign up for it. You'll get it in your inbox, and it'll give you lots and lots and lots of useful information. We have another team called COVID This Week, which is just a different format and much more detailed and much more of the things like these are all the variants and this is how the variants are changing, but in much more detailed. Weather Report is shorter. COVID This Week is the more detailed look. Two different teams, two different ideas of how they want to look at it. So underpinning all of this is the University of Orange, a Free People's University in Orange, New Jersey, which acts as fiscal sponsor. We've raised some money to support infrastructure, and we provide the infrastructure for this thing, but it's powered by the volunteers who join these teams. This is a coalition of people with different backgrounds, different ideologies, different takes on what's going on in the world. Edgar has taken on the position, part of the infrastructure, of being the facilitator of our weekly meetings. And boy, does it take all of his medical anthropology skills to keep us all moving forward. And also a lot of his just deep humanity and love for people. So this is a page from our website. What is the People's CDC? A coalition of public health practitioners, scientists, healthcare workers, educators, advocates, and people from all walks of life working to reduce the harmful impacts of COVID-19. And we want people to know the pandemic is not over. So there's sort of like the thing where the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention changed the map. So they said, no, we're going to make the map this way. That made the map look green. Meanwhile, if you use the old thing, the map was still red, and the old thing was more accurate. So it was a completely false impression that the pandemic is over. And guess what's happening? People are continuing to die at the rate of 400 a week. So we think that, I think I can click to exit and stop the share, bringing together coalitions that can address some of these issues, that can, as TAG did, give people useful and important and fundamental information. This is what we believe in and what we're trying to do. The thing about this is that it is a form of mutual aid. The Montgomery bus boycott, one of the things people had to do was get to work. And so they had to find all kinds of ways because they couldn't take the bus. So one of the things that happened in mutual aid was that people all over the country sent shoes, because if you had to walk 6 miles to get to work, you wore out your shoes very quickly. So people all over the country sent shoes to Montgomery. People in Montgomery raised money for the boycott. There were some women who became very, very famous because they would cook meals and sell them and give the money to the boycott. People who organized shared their cars to get a taxi service. And then all kinds of pushback from the white power structure to try to suppress this mutual aid. So the power structure understands that mutual aid is dangerous, and mutual aid can help people survive. That's what we're trying to do. And we understand that our coalition is fragile, as all coalitions are, but we also understand that coalitions have the potential for great progress in this complex society. So what have we learned from past epidemics, and what do we know now? It's that analysis is important. You've got to do this conjunctural analysis. You've got to know what's the situation. You've got to hold your coalition together. And that means that you also have to deepen people's understanding, because I have my goals and somebody else in the coalition has their goals. And to the extent that you can keep everybody on the same page, keep your coalition together, that's the extent to which you're going to be successful in the long run. But keeping a coalition together, you have to know it's hard. And finally, I just really want to second what Edgar said, that you have to be able to draw on soul power. So one of the things that happens at the People's CDC is that every meeting opens with music and closes with music. It's not exactly the Monday evening prayer meetings of the Montgomery bus boycott, but we might have to go there. So thank you all so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fuilov. And now we're back on our regular schedule, which is great. Pato, please.
Thank you, Carlos, for all you've done to make it possible for us to be here today. And thanks to Tanya and everybody here at the library. It's really an honor to be with Edgar and Mindy on a day like today is a real privilege. I was going to say treat, but World AIDS Day never feels quite like a treat to me, even as important as it is. The title of my illustrated performative reading is I See Our Beautiful Bodies in the Sky. I don't know if we can get the slideshow up. I'm going to try and weave a few pieces of writing and some recent artworks that I've created while living with long COVID and with my long history of creating and organizing in relationship to HIV. So Edgar and Mindy, we'll see what we can do about mutual aid and soul power in the next 20, 25 minutes. This is a picture of me last April, weeping in the back room of my solo exhibition titled Lingering, which was curated by Ruti Talmor and shown at Pitzer College. We're looking at a piece called Better But Not Well, charred salvaged California live oak and salvaged melted auto parts. It's from 2021. I'm going to read from a social media post from January of 2022, so the start of this year. Way back in my second month of being sick, April 2020, Better But Not Well became my standard reply to people's loving, concerned, and sometimes incredulous questions about how I'm feeling. I do notice shifts and subtle improvements every 3 months or so, and that's been true over these first 2 years of being sick. Everybody's response to this coronavirus is unique, and my symptoms continue to shift and evolve. I still deal with headaches, insomnia, brain fog, GI pain, overstimulation, struggles with organization, motivation, and focus, and the many emotional and spiritual challenges that come with chronic illness, like masking when I want to be smiling so you can see. I can make my offerings of thanks for being here, and I do, daily, at least as often as I cry, which I do all the time now thanks to COVID leaving with a condition called pseudobulbar effect. My neurologist explained the condition to me, the diagnosis for all of my puddles. She said, some people laugh like the Joker in the Batman movies, and others cry, like La Llorona, I think, like me. I suppose this COVID symptom is also a syndrome, but I think of the tears as libations, and for me they come most often in moments of wonder, appreciation, and joy. Pacing and care help greatly, as do mutual aid and community. And here we're looking at another piece from the exhibition. This one's called Mutual Aid, and it's carved from a salvaged eucalyptus limb that had fallen in a 2020 storm. Vaccines and boosters are vital, but they're only part of the ongoing changes that we need. And Edgar and Mindy spoke so well of the structural and the historical, the power and fragility and urgency of coalition. We need access to quality-free healthcare, medicine, testing and prevention tools, mental health support and somatic healing, paid sick leave, flexible work schedules and adjusted workflows, safe housing, nutritious food, clean water, vitamins and anti-inflammatory supplements, harm reduction, updated policy and legal frameworks. These can all make the difference between life and death. So can countering social isolation and ensuring vibrant, safe interconnectedness with one another. And this piece is called Hold Me. The work gives a sense of something transformed, and this is the tree that shed its limb in that winter storm back in 2020. I am something and someone transformed. Together, we here at this gathering are a beautiful network of intersecting and fantabulous relations, transforming one another and our shared world. And this piece is called Spoonies, which those of us who have to ration our spoons of energy when living with chronic illness, we show up for each other in mutual aid in all kinds of different ways and call each other Spoonies. While living with long COVID, on many occasions I've written about how grateful I am for my 3 decades of vibrant HIV community, the practices and wisdom we've made together. I frequently thought of this billboard from way back in 2000 that features a selfie in the shower by Paulo Rosco and the tagline, "Our tears are here to cleanse us." It was part of the large-scale campaign titled HIV Still Here, So Are We, which I developed with the Los Angeles communities most impacted by HIV and the support of George Ayala, who was the then Deputy Director of LA County's Office of AIDS Programs and Policy. Would Edgar remind us about intervening both inside and outside? The overall campaign contributed to a threefold increase in the number of calls to the California HIV/AIDS hotline. Some of us are old enough to remember those before we had it in the palm of our hands. Here's another billboard from that same campaign. Its tagline read, "We move with passion and desire." After the men's room closed on Ivar, and before Dirty House got started at Akbar, Tony Poyle's house nights were bouncing around a few different spots across Hollywood. After one of these nights, a gloriously sweaty release in a dark basement lined with bricks, I headed home, east along Santa Monica Boulevard, for 10 minutes or so, and then just south on Vine to get some comida at the Cactus Taqueria, the late-night stand that Carlitos had introduced me to soon after I first moved to LA. I walked through all the borrachos and up to the window, placed my order, and stepped back to wait for the hot, greasy al pastor goodness to come. I looked north, and there it was floating in the sky, beautiful dancing bodies. Like the ones I'd just been with, like the one I just was, moving with passion and desire. I realized that as an artist, it doesn't get any better than this. Seeing work made with others, alive in the social geographies and political imperatives that birthed it. I could not contain my smile as I stood on that after-hours sidewalk, marveling at my blessings and our collective resilience, while minding the rumble in my tummy and all of our dead who had not made it. In more recent years, I've wondered if that assertion, that collective love letter in the sky back in 2000, was naive and painfully aspirational. But ARVs were only a few years old then, and we were only a few months into the HIV horror that was the Bush administration, with all its hatred and restrictions. When I remember the violence and stakes of this political context, the prohibition of our desires, the suppression and stigmatization of our movements, I remember why declarations such as "we move with passion and desire" were and are irreverent, vital, tactical, and healing. Now in December of 2022, I lament that I haven't been to a club or on a dance floor in over 3 years. Because of long COVID, my brain starts to melt after even just 10 minutes of exposure to loud or competing sounds. And sometimes this body that I inhabit, this body that I'm learning to share with COVID's traces and ghosts and ongoing demands, sometimes this body has struggled to move at all. On April 3rd, 2020, early in my days of being ill with COVID, I posted the following on social media. I no longer understand time. My temporal intuition and rhythm are shot. A COVID-19 day feels like a dog year. So much happens, alters, inspires, unnerves, exhausts, helps, evolves, devolves, accelerates, competes, intensifies, heals, unravels, overwhelms, exhales. Today is wiping me the fuck out. Triage for a beloved who's too weak to talk and reached out via text for help contacting their doctor for guidance. Later, I was cooking some brunch in the kitchen, listening to some house music for comfort and fuel. In the middle of nudging some protein in the wok, I did the simplest and briefest of shimmy steps. It felt fleetingly great to syncopate my torso, culo, and limbs. And then it left me completely exhausted. Not even a whole chorus worth of movement. Eventually went back to bed, trying to nap. No deal. This is not uncommon. Even at night, solid sleep has unfriended me, no matter how much NyQuil and melatonin I offer in seduction and supplication. So that was 2.5 years ago. Someday, I will be back on a dark, sweaty, pulsing dance floor once again. I may be the only one masked, but someday I will try to move again with all the passion and desire that I can muster. My friend Trilce Santana, a DJ, Spanish language interpreter, and fierce organizer for housing justice, she encouraged me to try some special DJ and concert earplugs that can reduce the decibels but still allow in the range. They recently arrived. I am hopeful. I met Trilce through community organizing around HIV and queer Latinx liberation, a little while after creative writing reshaped me. In 1993, an evening of poetry and short stories changed my life. I was living in a San Francisco apartment of lesbians, one of them my partner at the time. A roommate handed me this flyer and said I should go. I did, and I had never seen or heard fabulous brown men and queerdos share like that in public. Organized by writers and AIDS activists Ricardo Bracho and Jesse Johnson, the Rites of Mourning showed me a different way through words, fierceness, and feels. That reading and Ricardo's activist vision and skills ushered me into the power of community organizing and pleasure. Mobilized at Proyecto contra SIDA por Vida, the Project Against AIDS for Life, a grassroots HIV services organization and community space, multi-gendered, multilingual, sex-positive, a harm reduction world for queer Latinx folks to congregate, flirt, heal, and dream, long before the ECI was signifying our specialness. And here, we're looking at an outreach brochure featuring the logo, collaged by Willie Chavarria and designed by Pail of Water Design. What is the half-life of an HIV intervention? How might we measure its impact, shortcomings, balm, seeding power over time, over decades? Here is Ricardo with Netza back in 1996. They recently gathered at the end of October in New York City to celebrate Netza's birthday. Here is Persephone on the cover of our youth brochure, Ike, which stood for young, queer, and under emergency, and in Spanish means, so what? It's 1996, and here Raul and Horacio, al chulos y besos, on some side street in the East Mission that we quickly claimed so I could make their image. Much of this community forged against HIV also coalesced around a South of Market nightclub called Pan Dulce, the brainchild of Rafa Negron. Today, I'm thinking about Club Q in Colorado Springs and the spaces that we make and value together, the ways that we shapeshift, morph, evolve, and survive over time. That's Horacio, sweaty and fine in his light-colored shirt, bailando in the middle of the dance floor. A queer oral historian, he understood the stories in our cuerpos y movimientos. Horacio shared his writing in Corpus, an art journal that served as an HIV prevention intervention for queer men of color from 2003 to 2008. It was published by AIDS Project Los Angeles, now APLA Health. Several issues were developed in conjunction with Gay Men's Health Crisis in New York. Nearly 20 years ago, I reached out to Horacio, and he contributed the essay, Teresita's Blood. In that piece, he wrote, "It's me, Horacio, your mother. You're neglecting your mother. I was waiting for you, and I know you probably couldn't make it, but I'm over here at Hermanos de Luna y Sol. Leave a message for Sergio. I don't know what you're up to, but the watermelons are going down. Okay, goodbye." Teresita's voice on my answering machine was always loaded, this time in English, in a serious tone and calling me from San Francisco's Mission Neighborhood Health Center. She was reminding me that I had failed her, yet again. She knew the intricacies of language and emotions. In Spanish, she could be loud and crass, obnoxious and outrageous. But in English, that's when she meant business. She was seriously now, barely joking about her quote-unquote watermelons, giving me options to return her message. Mother had called, and her queer son had missed the cry. Teresita was living with AIDS when she called me, a year and 4 months before her death in July 2002. She had been a long-term survivor, benefiting somewhat from 1990s pharmaceutical promises, but she'd also been a victim and survivor for much longer than that. 6 decades of the queer life of a transgender Latina. Born Alberto in 1940 in Los Angeles, pushed out of her blood family and bashed constantly by the police, young Alberto became Alberta and turned Teresita. She grew to be the live ranchera singer, fighting through and through, to be queer and loud and bilingual and an artist. Though pushed and bashed, she reimagined with us, as hungry for life as ever. Now in 2001, her liver and kidneys slowly beginning to fail, her condition growing worse, and her testicles swollen with fluid. Teresita was getting close to her end. The watermelons would go down, but never completely. I met Teresita, this is Horacio writing, in 1994 when I left for San Francisco from LA with the pretense of going to UC Berkeley, but mainly because I had to leave behind the heterosexual history I stopped pretending to live in 1991. San Francisco was supposed to be the queer Mecca, so I left, a young gay Latino desperate to become queer, similar reasons of geography and sexile that marked Teresita's departure in 1958. Luckily, I landed in the middle of a queer Latino renaissance in the making, in the bodies of Proyecto Contrasida por Vida. But I also landed in the historical shadow of Teresita, who, sitting on one of the sofas of this HIV agency in the mission, smiled and flirted and joked and dazzled all of us younger queers with her Teresita tales of transgender survival. For a fag born in the age of AIDS and its ravages, and hungry for historical roots of queer Latino anything, history began and ended with Teresita. She was all the evidence I needed then. From that moment on, I happily walked in the shadow of Teresita, more concerned with the intricacies of her life than whatever the latest queer theory academic publications were. Teresita was a walking archive, and a talking one, a dizzying narrative of live Lola Beltran rancheras dipped in queer specificity of 1950s LA bars, 1970s gay hippie drug spins, and 1980s viral madness, echoing Mindy's beautiful title. And she cared back for me too, because I, Teresita, knew I gave a fuck about queer historical memory and erasure, and could not let go of Alberta Navarez's voice in the middle of the assimilationist noise around us. So I recorded hours of oral history with Teresita, which began, of course, with her live songs as she demanded, and wound their way around her mother and her siblings and the art of passing as a woman at a bar in Stockton, next to the fields, worked their way to San Francisco's Mission District when she made history with other revolutionary perverts of the streets, like Uki La Tigresa. In queer and straight worlds alike, I held on tight to this historical debris, trying not to let any of it spill yet again onto our dustbins of silence. And yet, in all our years of travel and walking tours of the city, Teresita never got my own name right. Back in 1995, when we were just beginning to record, her messages in my answering machine said Ignacio. When I'd see her in person, and that's Teresita in the back in blue, Alejandra's in red in the front, she'd realize she'd messed up, but still could not quite get it to the very end. Often it was Horacio, part playfulness, I think, part the occasional persistent error of an illiterate artist who could nevertheless remember lyrics quite well. But it was fine with me. Correcting your elders is tricky, and even though it annoyed me, I always enjoyed too much being part of Teresita's spelling of my own life. I had too much respect for her existence to bother correcting an irrelevant detail. Teresita made me want to write and research queer Latino lives, to help create all those records of laughter and pain and gender camouflage, of butches and femmes and fags and boys playing with their own survival in our own communities. And so for years, I interviewed and left messages and returned phone calls and harassed other people to let me be the one with whom they could share their memories of desire, like Teresita's, like those of her body. And many agreed, This was to be my contribution to the queer Latino Renaissance of 1990s San Francisco. So that's from the third edition of Corpus, 2004. This is Horacio and Raul in 1996. Here is Raul Coronel just a few months ago, hanging out in LA. He's thriving as a professor at UC Berkeley. His first book was A World Not to Come, A History of Latino Writing and Print Culture. Horacio also brought books into the world. Here is Bodies of Evidence, The Practice of Queer Oral History, which he co-edited with Nan Alamila Boyd. She reminded us that Horacio's work asks, quote, what language do we use to remember things that historically are outside language? How do we put into words experiences that are so meaningful or so painful that they can't be spoken, end quote. Horacio taught at UC Santa Barbara. He was writing an oral history of the queer Latinx San Francisco Bay Area. We lost his brilliance in 2015. Here's a poster that Ricardo spearheaded and Sarah Patterson designed for Horacio's memorial in San Francisco. Horacio Enroque Ramirez asked us, what does a queer archive of the dead do to our knowledge of ourselves? At the most basic level, it reminds us to remember, challenging us not to fall into the enticing everyday practice of forgetting, of not looking back, end quote. Horacio died on a sidewalk in Silver Lake as Christmas Eve turned to Christmas morning. Had he made it through that long, chilly night, this is what he might have seen upon awakening. The following year, I gave a presentation to community in Sao Paulo, sharing Horacio's practice and his wisdom. A design collective asked if they could translate his words into Portuguese and create posters for a community voguing event and house ball in downtown. I like to think Horacio was smiling and toasting all the while. I knew about Raul being in town because I got a text from my dear compa Ray. Ray and I met in 2003 when he joined us at APLA to run our youth HIV prevention program. And here we are, just late last summer, on a walk in LA's Elysian Park, which is where I'd salvaged the eucalyptus wood that became the spoons that I showed you earlier. Ray was an amazing community organizer, and he still does profoundly important HIV work as a mental health specialist in East Los Angeles, not far from where Edgar's joining us right now. When we worked together at APLA, he spearheaded all kinds of dynamic engagement with our young people. Here's Cesar and Jimmy, cousins, vamping in the mall. We would hand out digital cameras because this is before most folks could make pictures with a thing in their hand called a cell phone. So they would take it out for a week and make pictures of whatever they were doing, including going to the immigration rallies from March 2006. This is Jerome and an organizer at a youth conference. Outreach flyer, want to try something new? Whenever I go to a clinic, they give me a disposable surgical mask. I've been saving them since becoming ill in March 2020. This is a selfie I took in early April 2020 when I went to urgent care because I was having trouble breathing. I've had these masks electroplated in nickel, an unprecious metal that looks silverish. This is one from my pulmonary function lab test on March 12th, 2021. I have 26 of these masks from my COVID visits. The series is called No Silver Linings, Long Hauling, and is presented on 3 gallery walls as a timeline of my interfacing with the medical establishment. Here, we have some from last December, my pre-op, surgery, and SIBO breath test masks. You reach out to me in tears. Tell me your relationship of 2 decades is now opening up, but not by your initiative or choice. You use other words too, disintegrating, transitioning, ending. You talk about all that you're learning while navigating these new realities and feelings, reading Too Good to Leave, Too Bad to Stay, reading The Ethical Slut, remembering to take your PrEP pill each morning. You say, it's been a week now of having this shit in my system. You laugh out loud. So I guess now I'm good? I haven't been in the game for 20 years. Now I feel lost in the world of apps and profiles and swipes. And we're still in a pandemic, 3 of them. I didn't consent to this. I laugh too. Say, Maybe the gotta is a get to. We don't just have to grow, we get to. We get to learn things like compersion and letting go. We both laugh, but I'm not sure either of us are too convinced. We talk about how the rush of someone else's fancy can lead to the crush of ego and feelings of inadequacy. Middle-aged magic, less assured, if still alluring. I had planned to get my first round of the monkeypox vax a week before my bivalent COVID booster. I wanted a little downtime in case I had a bad reaction. But the nurse tells me kindly, yet with a wince, that I can't get them so close together. I have to get them at least 1 month apart. I'm frustrated, but the choice is obvious. I'm a long hauler, and I'm over 50. So I roll up my t-shirt sleeve at Clinica Medica Fatima on 8th and Alvarado and boost away, knowing that the school mask mandates are lifting just as flu season and the likely winter surge approach. I add shingles and pneumococcal to the mix. I've been way overdue for these, but was just too wiped out from long COVID to stay on top of everything. The Trigueña nurse leaves me to wait for my observational period. After 5 minutes, she returns. "Se siente lightheaded?" she asks sweetly and professionally. "No," I half lie and steady myself, wobble to my feet once she's headed back down the hall. Like AIDS, COVID is not over. As if my own long hauling weren't enough proof, I'm reminded over and over again. A student pulls me aside in the hallway to talk about that long COVID thing. I didn't even know that was real, but I think I might have that, the brain fog and fatigue. A longtime friend from harm reduction organizing asks if I would be open to speaking to their friend who's struggling with the vertigo and insomnia of long COVID. Another writes to me about their growth and shifts post-infection, thanks me for the stories I shared when I took them Pedialyte when their congestion worsened. All folks of color, all in the last several months. I had 11 blood family members get infected this summer. I can't even count the number of chosen family members. Regardless of what President Biden and Congress say, COVID is most definitely not over, and I'm almost done, and we'll get to our discussion. Returning to my solo exhibition from last spring in a piece called Talking in Circles. It's informed by the social distancing circles spray painted by public health officials in urban parks, such as here in Domino Park in an image by Eduardo Munoz for Reuters. Talking in Circles is made from mirrored gold acrylic, evoking the chintzy aesthetic so favored by the former US president, who willfully lied and obfuscated. The piece appears in a typeface that designer Mark Davis digitized from the former president's handwriting and named Tiny Hands. Talking in Circles quotes the former president, who said early on in the COVID pandemic, "It's going to disappear one day. It's like a miracle. It will disappear." COVID hasn't disappeared, but neither have we. A little while ago, I was talking smack with my bestie Jaime, author of the marvelous book of short stories, Gordo. We were trying to imagine who was the first Cuina to be irreverent and fabulous as a form of resistance, survival, and joy. Was it some Neanderthal queen celebrating her fur at the first underground bears club, 3 caves down from the saber-toothed tiger's S&M spot? It makes me think about Jose Esteban Munoz and all them futurities he conjured and wrote about. And so I close con cariño, with affection. Here are Roberto and Carlitos, set to embrace in the atmosphere of Pan Dulce in 1996. Carlitos on the right in his vintage stilo, Roberto on the left with his baby blue nails and devil tattoo. 2000, I repurposed this image for the HIV Still Here, So Are We campaign in LA. I once wondered if a billboard could be a talisman, if our beautiful bodies in the sky might ward off infection and destruction, racism and homophobia, xenophobia and hunger, if our affections might conjure endless magic and delight. Here's an image of it on Sunset Boulevard, kitty corner from Akbar, where Tony Powell's house night would later take over on Thursdays and flourish. Carlitos and Tony are still finding ways to thrive. It breaks my heart to say that Roberto cannot. For he and his beautiful self passed in 2014. Contracido con cariño, our placas read, against AIDS with affection. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Pato, Carlos, Mindy, Edgar. On behalf of the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice, we so appreciate your participation and you being here. My name is Tanya Bentley. I'm the Communications and Marketing Director for the Institute, and I'd like to just give our online audience some more information on how they can ask questions. In the video description on the YouTube link where you are currently watching this, there is a link at the very, very top of the video description that says to ask a question, click this link. It is an additional link. If you don't see that link displayed, please refresh your browsers. If you are watching on a mobile device, please make sure that you access the video description. It's at the very, very bottom of the video. There is an arrow to open that up, and you will see, again, to ask a question, please click on this link. It is a Slido link. Carlos, take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pato. Thank you, Mindy. Thank you, Edgar. I wanted to begin by thinking through a bit of the way in which the presentations come together. And I think that there is a signature through line in them, and it has to do with the role of the dead. In harnessing that soul power that we need to try to address the kind of uncertainty and precarity of the present and the future, and to do the kind of conjunctural analysis that we need to do. We talked about Rosa Parks, we talked about Horacio, we talked about many of our, Horacio actually it took me aback that you would mention Horacio, Jose,
Edgar's mom.
The many we have lost before COVID, during COVID, the many whose pain has been silenced in the context of monkeypox due to neglect and due to an inability to sort of grasp that when something affects some of us, it affects all of us. That it's our collective problem, not just the problem of a specific population. We seem to have learned the lesson with COVID, and then we soon turned around and realized that no, we hadn't learned the lesson at all. So, to me, some of what we've experienced listening to you feels like an invocation. To some degree, almost like prayer, maybe closer to Pato's more explicitly in its invocation of a whole era that is very different from where we are now. I wanted to start with the dead and that sense of historicity that ancestral figures give us, offer us. The ones who are here in this room, who accompany us now because we've invoked them, we've brought them in, we've gathered them. The ones who accompany us despite our inability to see the gaps they've left, as a bit like the way we experience silence in music. We notate silence because silence is part of sound. It is a kind of sound. It's not the absence of sound, but it's a kind of sound. And if you learn to hear silence as a musician, you can deploy it in very exciting ways because it's not just a pause. It's a moment of inflection. It's a moment of rest. It's a moment of slowing down. Before COVID, in the last 6 or 7 years, I've experienced life in the U.S. Northeast as, in a way, much closer to my childhood, the way I experienced my childhood home in the Dominican Republic before arriving in the U.S. Very much tethered, connected, and anxious about hurricane season. It may have been that Hurricane Sandy traumatized me and shifted my I lost power for 12 days, so I didn't lose any of the big things that a lot of people lost. But to me, it was having come from a country that had a chronic problem with electricity to find myself in the U.S. realizing a suburban dream of home ownership, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and have that sense of bouginess shot with a 12-day long loss of power was a bit like I came all the way to the U.S. for this. This is this life. And since then, of course, from August through early November, I watch with anxiety and dread the comings and goings of hurricane season. I'm sharing this because part of that temporal map in my mind has begun to be also shaped by monitoring COVID rates. It's a different kind of monitoring because it's as if what I'm monitoring is not necessarily the comings and goings of hurricanes, which may wipe me out or wipe people I care about out, but it's another kind of figuration affecting the body politic. It's as if when I was watching the New York Times, I still do the little stats on the New York Times, and we see the surge and the numbers go up and down. It's as if I was doing an analogous thing to watching the Weather Channel, except that in that case, I'm trying to assess, okay, given the increase of rates, I need to wear a mask if I'm going to travel, make decisions about how I lead my life. So I believe, and I believe this not to be, though what I'm relaying is a very individual experience of this, that this is a much more collectively kind of sensed way of inhabiting a world like the one that we're living in. So the conjuncture is very much about this precarity, the growing precarity of the world that we're in, systems falling apart, and we've talked about the crisis of institutions. I was thinking recently about and reading up on what is going on with the long-term shift to evacuate cities and outsource everything so that the folks working from home are working from home on a permanent basis. And what does that mean for the future of cities? So some of what I'm sharing has a bit to do with a question that I would like to put to us to think through together about this moment that we're in. What is this moment that we're in? What is this conjuncture? And how do we connect or ask for the support of these ancestral figures, the ones we have invoked explicitly and the ones who are with us, irrespective of whether we invoke them or not, in the process of creating this soul power that we need. So I'm not sure of how we're going to do this. I like this Brady Bunch setup that we have now. So whoever wants to start.
Here's a story of Edgar and Mindy.
Yeah, we could.
One thing I would say, thank you for Pato. That was it was brilliant, but it was full of rage and love for me. Just to put my heart out there. Mucha ternura, pero mucha tristeza y poder. A lot of tenderness, a lot of sadness for me, and a lot of power. So thank you, Pato, for that intervention. I think maybe what you're hitting at, Carlos, is, and I'll just let Mindy respond too, is the end of the fantasy of insulation. And I think because we're at the center of an empire, there's a Disneyland aspect to the U.S. for certain populations. And I think it's that end and that precarity that you're talking about. Remember, in the early HIV/AIDS, crisis, you never asked someone, "Oh, did you test positive?" and now it's an open question around COVID. So I think there's a precarity piece and the end of a type of fantasy that we can isolate ourselves in any way. I'll leave it there.
Oh, I like how it's pulling back the camera, and there we are, the four of us. Hi. That was really mind-boggling. Yeah, that was so emotional. I was once right at the beginning of when I started doing AIDS research in 1986, so maybe 1987. I was on a panel about AIDS. I was a young researcher. What did I know? But one of the other people that was on the panel was a guy who literally was the Marlboro Man, and so he was just gorgeous and had these chiseled good looks and was dying of AIDS. And he talked about being the Marlboro Man and dying of AIDS, and it was overwhelming. And I was supposed to speak after the Marlboro Man. It was like impossible. How could anybody speak after the Marlboro Man? You couldn't. It was just nothing left to say. So yeah, I am really glad I got to speak before. Because there's certain things that are so deeply emotional, and that where we just have to live them in our hearts. There's just nothing more to say. And so I appreciate the question, but I'm kind of having that, that experience that it has all been said. That how do you sum up this moment? That any of those moments in describing, but perhaps the photograph of the blue pill in the tan bowl, and the sort of, I want to take this pill and go out and have fun. But I haven't done that in years, and I don't really remember how. I mean, in a way that sums up where we are. There's supposed to be some miracle pill that's going to take all this away, or there's supposed to be electricity that's on all the time, or there's supposed to be a government that cares. All these things that are supposed to be, right? It's the little blue pill in the tan bowl. Wait, which is the one in the Matrix? Is it the blue one or the red one? Anyway, it's kind of like that blue pill said, I can never remember which one you take if you want to become alive or you want to go back.
It's the purple pill, Mindy.
It's that. It sums it all up. What an extraordinary picture in the context of all that was said. That little blue pill in the tan bowl.
I just joked, Mindy, sorry to step on your toes, but it's the purple pill, the blue and the red pill. But I actually feel like, and this is a tribute, I think, to Carlos, your curation, but the unanticipated but present weave was really beautiful. Like, I should have known that Edgar was going to speak about Pasión, right, and soul work, and I should have known from Mindy's work that she would have us reminded that mutual aid and coalition has been forever, and it will be fragile forever as long as we're confronting what we are. But to your question about the moment, I'm taking a lot of encouragement from abolition's reminder to us all that no one is free until we are all free, and holding that in relationship to disability justice's reminder of something quite similar. And I am seeing these two, I was about to draw a distinction between abolition and disability justice, but I'm seeing these deep traditions that inform them both no longer be so distinguishable across a number of movements, including climate crisis or including the housing crisis, which are linked. So I'm feeling great hope and courage and coalition and mutuality because of that. There is something really special about how we are, some of us, responding to this precarity. There are other days, of course, when I'm just tumbao, I'm just done and hopeless, and my pseudobulbar effect is just nonstop and I'm crying all day. But I'm really quite moved by what Edgar was reminding us about how connected we all are. You said it in your comments. And Mindy's reminder that these are quite fragile. We have to keep working at them. And part of my presencing of dance, because I haven't been able to dance, is that play and pleasure are instrumental to that too. El retiro, the retreat, right? The slowing down, that all these forms. And I'm seeing that more and more in emerging and very fierce young generations of leaders too. Not leaving mental health aside, not leaving rest aside, not leaving massage and healthy food aside. That the romance of burnout, which is hard not to succumb to in the face of annihilation. Like, were you going to take a nap while you're getting annihilated? And yet, no, because we want to build on those who have come for centuries, right? And be able to be here for centuries more. So the simplest way I would sum that is to say that by invoking and constantly holding and honoring and presencing our antepasados, our elders, our guías, our guides, is this beautiful dance against erasure and this beautiful possibility towards the future.
There's something quite powerful about the way Mindy sort of executed this flashback to a very different time where difficulties were insurmountable, and yet people persevered. That whole Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman sort of exchange, and the duration of and the investment, and here we go with clunky verbs again, the kind of the time you end up having to put in, the dedication, and the fact that we have to do this on belief, on faith. There is an element of faith. I found when I came of age as a gay man that despite that sense of gloom, of doom that many of us experienced at the time, the immediate trauma of our elders put us in a position where there was no way we could go back or sit complacently. That if we were going to be gay, we were going to be the most flamboyant gay we could be. Because that was an affirmation of life, right? I find now that this is what a lot of our young people are doing. That their response is not, I keep thinking of that Lars von Trier film, Melancholia, the one where the moon is coming. And the structuring of that film is that the expectation of the end of the world. It's a little bit like the Hollywood spin-off, which is a bit of the same thing. I can't recall the one with Leonardo DiCaprio, is it? The one where basically the sky is falling. Melancholia is really structured around this sense of impending doom and end. And that in a way betrays a certain kind of privilege. And many of us come from places where we know our people never had much time to sit on ceremony while shit was falling apart. That we had to do stuff because the only way many of us are here in the first place is precisely because many before us have made a way out of no way in times of extreme duress. So I think that ammunition is really an important ingredient. But I also think that even thinking and sort of accompanying these presentations, it's also the histories that we've built with each other. And I don't mean just the people who are in this space, but the people in these collectives who, in a way, like the People's CDC, you eventually begin to say, you know what? The state is not going to do this for us. Institutions are not going to do it for us. We can read. We've been trained to do research. Let's just lift some of these materials and start speaking truth to power from the basis of the kind of training that we've brought to the table and the acumen and the independence that we can achieve through these systems of mutual aid. So I think that's another one of the through lines that we these collectives, the collectives that we're all talking about are collectives that have had autonomous systems of accountability, if you will, autonomous institution building, and necessarily autonomous pooling of those resources and those passions. I also haven't been to a bar in a while, so I miss that, right? Because there is a certain ferment, a certain energy that's generated in those spaces. Oh, thank you.
I just want to, Mindy, I was so moved by both presentations and the weaving you're doing, Carlos. And Mindy, you reminded us through Ms. Parks that precisely by sitting down, we move by not moving, but concertedly, right? And I just thought that was, a very significant reminder.
And Edgar had begun one of the points. I mean, Edgar, you and I, when COVID first happened, and I had no idea what in the world was going on, because as we all recall, not that anybody wants to recall how it was, but the way we pivoted in a week during spring break, actually, it was seismic. It was literally, you walked out your door. It was like the planet was a different planet. You did not. I stopped walking. I used to walk a lot. I stopped going out. It was immediate. And I remember one of the first things that you said to me was, we have to slow down. We have to slow down and observe. And that's something you mentioned today. That element of slowing down is absolutely crucial, because there is a logic to the crisis mode. And those of us who've experienced family crises of different kinds, I know I have, know that so oftentimes when everything is going absolutely crazy, somebody, one person, needs to have enough acumen to remove themselves and say, okay, this is what we need to do. While the telenovela is like raging, right? And all kinds of crazy are happening. Somebody has to make decisions, because somebody has to figure out if there is going to be a funeral, how that's going to happen, who's paying for this, how's this getting financed, blah blah blah. And we may all be crying, and we may all be going crazy, but not all of us can be taking a deep dive into this. Of course, the challenge there is, how do we heal the healer? How do we support the first line responders, if you will, in our worlds? I experienced immense gratitude whenever I went to the supermarket, to the point, when I could go, to the point where it was like, I experienced the gratitude, but I also experienced the class differentiation and what that meant. That I was going to go in, and that this other person who's at the counter is literally putting their life on the line when we had no vaccines, we had none of the other stuff going on. And so I think that that element is a crucial one to keep in mind. And then there's also what we learn collectively that the systems don't learn. I have to say, and I will hand my props to all my queer brethren out there, that all of us queer sluts of the world were the ones who lined up to get our monkeypox shots the moment they were made available. Because we owned whatever this was, right? There was a sense of like, well, this is what it is. It's available. The moment it becomes available, people began to line up and do what they needed to do, partly because there is that historical memory, right? And I think that's another part of this, that there is a wisdom that emerges in these communities of care around how we mobilize, how we respond, and to what degree we can lean on or not on the state and its institutions in whichever shape they're in.
I think that's spot on, and I appreciate about those points before around this question of temporality. I mean, I just had I had an experience not too long ago where an undocumented Filipino queer just who couldn't go to college wanted to. She just said to me, "Sometimes I think the only thing I know is work, hard work. That's the only thing I know now." And it reminded me of that C.L.R. James quote, like, "What do they know that only cricket know? And what do they know that only struggle know? They know everything. They just need to work it out." And I think one of the things that these crises sort of do for us is reaffirm that there are many things that we need to develop, but the problem is a systemic one. It's this structure that's the problem, that's really messed up. But our folks, they're going to continue to struggle. And I don't see our folks as a problem. I see them as the reservoirs of potential, change and freedom. I think you're spot on there, Carlos and Pato.
So, shall we have, I guess we'll have some final thoughts as we wrap up here. We're close to 5:30. Perhaps Mindy and Pato want to share some final thoughts. Since Edgar spoke.
Yeah, I'm done.
Yeah.
Well, so my team were urbanists, and so when we figured out that December 5th was the first day of the Montgomery bus boycott, we said, well, obviously that's the urbanist world holiday. So we started to always plan a big event on December 5th. And this was back in 2002, I think was our first December 5th party. So guess what? There was a huge snowstorm. And then 2003, there was a huge snowstorm. In 2004, there was a huge snowstorm. In 2005, there was a huge snowstorm on December 5th. But when I looked at, so of course it's time to look at my weather app, right? What's going to happen on December 5th? Because of course I have plans. But the weather app says, I'll tell you what it says. Very important. It says that on December 5th, which is Monday, is going to be sunny. And there's rain, but there's no freezing temp, there's no storm. So all of our lives are affected by these huge shifts in our planetary situation. And I was reading a meditation this morning where a reverend said, we could fix the Christian church, but what's the point if we're all dead from the sixth extinction? So, we're supposed to take the warning from AIDS, the warning from COVID. These are emerging infections coming out of the destruction we've done to the ecosystem. The fact that we could have a party on December 5th is also a warning. We're supposed to take this seriously. And paradoxically, we're not supposed to get hysterical. We're not supposed to skip lunch. We can still take a nap. I have no idea how you do that. And so can we just leave with that question? Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Mindy, and what it means to hold that complexity, that paradox. Edgar, you and I have spoken a lot about temporality, you reminded us not to move at the insistent assault of a crisis, but also hold the urgency. What's that paradox, right? And I guess I would just add scale to the mix, that clearly we need structural change at such a scale that it can boggle. But Mindy, I so appreciated your reminder that it was a coalition that ended slavery in this country, following the lead of other coalitions in other parts of the world, right? And when I think about scale, and this is something that disability justice is teaching me and being sick, the mutual aid might be as simple as some Pedialyte. And that actually isn't insignificant if you can't get to the market or you don't have any money because you haven't been able to work, right? And that mutual aid reminds us that it's the coordination and the cascading of these seemingly small scale interventions that actually mean everything. And if we can mobilize to hold those lessons in relationship to the structural inequity we're against, then there's a possibility. And that, the challenge of that is really hard. Like, a little piece of eucalyptus turned into a spoon ain't gonna do shit, really. And yet, you know, I didn't go into it at length, but that eucalyptus is not indigenous to Southern California. It's only growing in that land because of colonialism. And yet butterflies have adapted to it and found ways to make it. And eucalyptus in Australia, as indigenous folks there know, can be a deeply healing being, a relation, right? So something about that was also trying to work with these legacies of colonialism and the gift that there was a large-scale urban park open for free in the middle of the second largest city in this country. We just found out it's one of the 4 most expensive cities in the entire world, Los Angeles. The daily intervention that free accessible public space had, at least for the people who were in proximity, was not lost on me. So I'm trying to hold that in relationship to the climate crisis. And there's all kinds of scales and sites in which we can intervene together. And sometimes it's the dance floor. And sometimes it's in a library at Rutgers. And sometimes it's a caricia that just reminds you, I got you, boo, I got you. And sometimes it's protest or an uprising. And I think we're gonna need that whole toolbox and more if we want to be the ancestors of another 7, 14, 15, 50 generations.
Well, I want to thank you all for humoring this process of launching a year-long collective reflection, and inviting the Rutgers community and others to engage different dimensions of the viral in the vital. Thank you for being with us today. And I want to express my gratitude to everyone who's here in the different ways in which we are here, both in person and virtual. Tanya?
We do have one comment online.
We do.
Yes. It's not a question, but it is a comment. And Pato, this is from Ray. He says, the work of memory is heavy, sacred, and necessary, as Horacio reminded us. Thank you for embodying that beautifully on Palabras y Imágenes. Thank you.
And I think that's probably the best closing we could possibly have, bringing us back to the ancestral guides who will hopefully accompany us in the process of becoming and opening the path for others who come after. So thank you all. Thank you to those of you who've graced us with your presence in every way that presence is manifest. And we look forward to other opportunities to interact with you in this series.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Pato. Thank you, Mindy. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.